Welcome to the Highland Heights Sunday morning Bible class. We are glad that you have joined us. We say it every week. We wish that we were in person, able to go to Bible classes together and have conversations with whoever could fit in the classroom, but alas, we cannot do that. But until then, we will continue to have these conversations online, and we're really glad that you joined us. If you haven't been with us in a while, you're in luck. We are starting a new series tonight. We just finished our series going through the 10 Commandments, looking at those foundational pillars that have set up not only Western society, but also us, the church, as we think about what God wants for us in our lives. Now, in some ways, the series we're getting into now is a really good follow-up to what we've talked about in the 10 Commandments series. We're talking about questions for God, what it means for us as Christians to have a relationship with God and to probe deeply into what it is that God wants for us in this life. It's part of our prayer life. It's part of the way we act as congregations to ask questions. And really, a good Bible education is built on that idea of asking questions of God. So, Jeremy, as we're starting off this series, how should we as Christians think about the questioning process?
Well, we should start with the idea you just brought up, that the goal of our questioning is to build a relationship. Sometimes I think we're a little hesitant to deal with this idea of questioning God. We're afraid. We don't want people to think that we are putting ourselves on the level of God, that we are lacking in faith. Okay, and so we don't want to go there, and that's not what we see. Many of the times that you have people in the Bible who go to God with questions, and it's about building a relationship. It is one thing to know things about God. Okay, I can get on Google and I can search information about someone, and I can tell you all kinds of facts and details about people. And when I'm teaching history classes, I will occasionally, go find odd tidbits about people to throw them in just to kind of pique the kids' interest. Okay. So I can throw in odd stories or interesting facts about Teddy Roosevelt. For example, Teddy Roosevelt once gave a speech after he had been shot. Someone actually shot at him. His speech was so thick it stopped the bullet, and he gave the speech and then went to the hospital. Okay, that's an interesting fact. I don't know Teddy Roosevelt, and I'll be hard pressed to know Teddy Roosevelt. But the same works for people we're contemporary with. You can know things about God, but that's different from knowing God. And so when we see people in the Bible, real people with real questions and real concerns going to God, what they're doing is they are plumbing the depths of God as best as we can, saying, God, I don't understand. I'm struggling with this, or I don't understand what's going on here. I want more information so that I can build a better relationship. And so when we think about questions, not as a venue for challenging God, so much as a venue for growing in the knowledge of who God is, then I think it becomes easier to ask. And it also puts us in a frame of mind to hear the answers. Okay. When God provides us with answers, we know, okay, this is part of the process of getting to know God and building that relationship.
Yeah. Part of building a relationship is honesty. And part of honesty is admitting that we don't know everything about the person that we're having a relationship with. So as we relate to God, we don't know everything about God. And so we have to be honest, and that requires asking questions. God, tell me more about this situation, or God, tell me more about what you're wanting to do, or even sometimes, God, tell me more about yourself. Later on in our series, we'll get to Job. And a lot of the questions that Job is asking is, God, I don't understand you. I think here's the way I think you should act, and here's the way that it seems to me that you're acting. Explain yourself. Put yourself, put me in the docket. So that is part of an honest relationship, is asking questions. And any relationship that you have, if you haven't learned something about the person recently, probably it's not a great relationship. It's not, at least it's not a growing relationship. It's not healthy in that way to where it's able to continue on. So as we are looking at individuals in the Bible that have asked questions of God, about God, they're asking a question in some way and asking that question to God. We as Christians are looking at those individuals and say, how does that affect the way that I ask questions? Sometimes they're asking questions in the right direction. Sometimes they're asking questions in the wrong direction. Sometimes they had the right heart, but were going in the wrong direction. And sometimes they just had a bad heart and they were asking because of that, they were asking bad questions. We'll get to that too. So tonight we are going to start off in Genesis chapter 18. Specifically looking at Abraham. We're going to look at the second half of the chapter, verses 22 through 33. And Jeremy, I'll just really quickly kind of go through what happens here, and then I'll hand it over to you to kind of start leading us through this. So Abraham, earlier in Genesis, Abraham and his nephew Lot, it's cousin's son, anyway, it's some relation. So Abraham and his nephew Lot are living together, but they decide to go in two separate directions because their herds are getting really big, and that's a good problem to have. And so Lot sees that the land over towards Sodom and Gomorrah looks really good, so he goes in that direction, and Abraham takes the other side. And God blesses Abraham in where he goes. However, we pick it up later, and we find out that Sodom and Gomorrah, as history tells us, is not a good place. And chapter 19 tells us more about that. And God tells Abraham that he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham then intercedes on behalf of not only his nephew Lot, but also on behalf of all of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then we get a very famous dialogue between Abraham and God. Now, I've never had a prayer life like this where I ask a question and God directly answers me back, but this is a different time. And so Abraham starts off at 50, and then he starts going down. And every time God says to Abraham, yes, for 50 people, for 50 righteous people, I will spare Sodom and Gomorrah, and goes all the way down. And then at the very end, this in verse 32, he gets down to 10. If 10 righteous people can be found, will you spare them? And God says, yes, even for 10. And then verse 33, I'll read this verbatim. And people, if you're participating in this conversation, you're probably thinking, Michael, you could have just read the whole thing in the time it just took you to explain it. But anyway, I'll read verse 33. And the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. The conversation just kind of comes to an end without any real resolution, at least in this chapter. It gets resolved a little later, but at the end of this chapter, they go their separate ways. So, Jeremy, lead us through. How do we think about this in terms of the questions that we ask?
Well, it's important to note, first of all, just for the sake of understanding kind of the overarching story, the context of what's going on here. Okay. The context of this is, that God has promised Abraham that he will make him into a great nation, that he will give him land, and that all nations of the earth will be blessed through him and his descendants. Okay. And the key part of that is to have land and to have descendants and to have the whole world be blessed through your descendants, you have to have a descendant. Okay. And so the key part of all this is God says, I'm going to give you a son. And if we're familiar with the story, we know Abraham tries various ways through his power to make that happen. Of course, that doesn't work. God keeps saying, no, I'll do it my way. Okay. Yeah. Patience. Okay. And 25 years worth of patience. Okay. And then in chapter 18, God and two of his messengers come to Abraham, and God says, this time next year, I'm going to give you a son. So now it's no longer someday you're going to have a son. There's a date, certain time that it will happen. You will have a son within a year. And then God says, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? And that's a key verse in this for a couple of reasons. One, God is about to tell Abraham of a major event. And this is a credibility moment. Okay. By tomorrow, Sodom and Gomorrah will be destroyed. Well, if Abraham gets up the next morning, Sodom and Gomorrah aren't destroyed. Okay, there's a problem. He gets up the next morning and they are destroyed. Okay, when God says something that he's going to do something, he means it. Okay, and remember, it's in the context of Sarah laughing. And before we give Sarah too much grief, Abraham laughed first. Okay, Abraham was the first one to laugh, and then Sarah laughed. Okay, so that's the context is God saying, you can trust me to do what I'm going to do. But there's something deeper going on, I think, here. God doesn't say, okay, by tomorrow, this little thing is going to happen, or this sign will occur. And God does that sometimes in the text of the Bible. He'll say, so that you know I'm going to do this, here is a sign. You know, Hezekiah, so that you know you'll live 15 more years, the shadow will go back 15 steps. Okay. Later on in the divided kingdom. Okay. It's what he chooses to reveal that I think is significant. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah are great. They're evil. And so I'm going to destroy them. Abraham's going, wait, time out here. Okay. We need to, and here let's remember the cultural context that Abraham would have grown up in. He hails from Mesopotamia. The Mesopotamian gods, if you've ever heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which tells the Babylonian version of the flood story. Okay. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the reason that the gods destroy the world with water is because men are loud and are making a lot of noise, and it's disturbing the gods' rest. Which is like, it's kind of funny, right? But think about in the context that Abraham lived in, the gods were cruel and they were capricious and they acted based on their own whims. And now here is God saying, I'm going to destroy these two cities. And in the back of Abraham's mind, he's going, what kind of God am I serving here? Who is this God, this Yahweh? And granted, the name Yahweh is not revealed until Moses, but who is this God that I'm serving? Who is this person? And so God gives him a reason to ask his questions. Notice God takes the initiative. God comes down and says, I'm going to destroy this city because they're evil. And Abraham goes, and it's interesting. In verse 22, it says, so the men, Genesis 18:22, so the men turned from there and went towards Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. Then Abraham drew near and said, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? So in my mind, I just have this vision of Abraham kind of standing there next to God, kind of waiting. If you've got a minute, God, I'd like to ask you something. And the key phrase in Abraham's questions is, will not the judge of all the earth do right? See, what he's asking is who is this God that I serve? What is the justice of God? What does it mean for God to be a just God? God, will you kill 50 righteous people because the city they live in is wicked? See, will God show mercy to those who do right, even when all around them are doing wrong? Okay. God says, yes, I'll spare the city for 50 people. Okay. God, how merciful are you? What if it's 5 less? Like, is this a hard and fast cutoff here? Like, oh, sorry, you didn't quite make it. Or will you show even more mercy? And Abraham keeps going down, and what he's doing is he's plumbing the mercy of God, and he's plumbing the justice of God. What does the justice of God mean? What does the mercy of God mean? Who am I serving? And this is a key point in Abraham's development of faith. And I really do think that Abraham, when he gets to Genesis 22, the sacrifice of Isaac, one of the things that's running through his head when God says, take your son and sacrifice him is, I don't know how this is going to work, but I know God and I know what I've learned about God. And this is probably a key point that he's thinking about in his head, going, I know God. When he says he's going to do something, he's going to do something. And God, he keeps his promises and he's a just God. So I'm going to do what he asked.
Yeah. So we see the transformation of the character of Abraham as he learned to trust God. And at first, with a group that he knows who they are, obviously, but he's never lived in Sodom. This is not his homeland. And then it comes home, and then it comes home to the justice for his own son, for Isaac. So how we see Abraham interacting with God is very interesting. And one of the debates that comes up here is Abraham actually bargaining with God? Put it this way: is God changing his mind? So oftentimes we think about this, that that we serve an unchanging God. But I'll put out my cards here. I think that we can take that statement too far and over define what it means to be an unchanging God. So when God says, I'm going to strike down these people, he has every right to do that. Everyone in the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, and for that matter, every city that's ever existed, has sinned, right? And is worthy of the punishment of death. Sodom and Gomorrah, at least what we know from here, is that they have been exceedingly evil, and God has decided to punish them for that reason. And so God doesn't have to have a number, but Abraham starts off at 50. And what we're led to believe is that Abraham asked for that number, and I wonder if Abraham was planning on bargaining down, plumbing the righteousness of, it's trying to figure out where does God, how big is God's mercy. But I wonder if he maybe just thought through his head, oh, wait a second, I don't know 50 people. Because he only knows a few people there, it makes me think that he's planning on, bargaining down, getting it down there. And so we're led to wonder, this is part of finding out who God is. Is God bargaining? Is God saying, well, sure, at that level? And perhaps if we don't think that God is changing his mind along the way, one of the things that we can pull from this is that God always was willing to spare the city, not just for one person. He was willing to spare the city with 0 righteous people, because he does that all of the time. And so the countdown, while it could be a bargaining chip, I think that God is, we have other examples of God listening to someone. For example, when God is destroying the Israelites, and Moses says, God, wait, hold on. And Moses, stands in between. There we see God changing his mind. From Moses, I'll do this. Moses gives an alternative suggestion, and God goes along with that. So we do see God changing his mind. Sometimes these aren't salvation issues necessarily, but here I don't think that this is an example of God changing his mind all the way down, but rather God responding to the direct question that Abraham is offering. Jeremy, what's your thoughts there? Am I somewhat close to what you're thinking?
Yeah, I think you're I think you're right that God always had in his mind that he was willing, and you look, it's almost like Abraham is saying, well, what if there were 50? Suppose there are 50 righteous in the city,
right?
Okay? And it's important to remember that to us, Sodom and Gomorrah are lost to the mists of history. Literally, we don't know where they are. We think we know where they are, but we don't know for certain where they are. Okay, they're nowhere now, but we don't know where they were. Okay, with certainty. These are real people in real places to Abraham. Just a few chapters earlier, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them are conquered by kings, by foreign kings, and Abraham takes the men of his household and goes and rescues the people of Sodom. And it's coming back that the king of Sodom offers the wealth of Sodom to Abraham, and Abraham refuses, and then Abraham donates 10% to Melchizedek, thank you. I knew it started with an M, and I was thinking Mephibosheth and Methuselah, and neither of those are right. Melchizedek, right. So this is, one of like 3 places in the Bible where Melchizedek is mentioned, is in the context of Abraham rescuing the people of Sodom. So these are real people. So Abraham probably knew very well what kind of city Sodom was. Okay. So So I think you're right to say that God would always spare the righteous. Okay, He is always willing to spare the righteous. And you look at it, God does spare a righteous man, or at least a man who is more righteous than the people of Sodom. And we know Lot was more righteous than the people of Sodom by the comparison between the way Lot treats the angels when they come and the way the men of Sodom attempt to treat the angels when they come. Mm-hmm. See, and Lot even comes out and says, no, don't do this. Now, he's been a little bit corrupted by the city of Sodom because he then offers his daughters, but he still tries to stop them. So Lot is at least more righteous than the men of Sodom, and God makes provision for Lot. So even though there aren't enough for God to preserve the city, God still preserves Lot from the destruction of the city and tries to preserve his family as well. Okay. But it's important to think when we ask, is Abraham bargaining with God? The way we think of bargaining is kind of like, you bargain at a car dealership, or, well, I can't, I'm not going to do that. How about this? And you go back and forth on it. Or like you're arguing, I'll give you this, you give me that. Okay. Abraham doesn't have that. This isn't bargaining in that sense, because what does Abraham have to offer God? Everything Abraham has belongs to God anyway. Okay. But it is Abraham, I think, going before God and saying, okay, let's talk through this. And let's work our way down. And he's kind of going, okay, where is the threshold? And I think part of the reason he stops at 10 is because, okay, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah would not have been nearly as large as cities today, but still, they're decent sized cities, probably several thousand people living there. And Abraham goes all the way down to 10. That is a minuscule fraction. A minuscule fraction. And so what Abraham has learned from this is God is not cruel and capricious. Okay. He's not doing this because the people annoy him. He's doing this because they are unrighteous cities. Mm-hmm. But God also respects righteousness, because he will spare the righteous. Okay. He will not kill the righteous because of the sins of the wicked in this case. Okay. And God is merciful. God is willing to spare the unrighteous to preserve the righteous. Okay. And it's a very, very, very small number that Abraham works his way down to. Okay. And I think Abraham stops at 10 because he has his answer. He knows he's known more about God, and he's learned, yes, the judge of all the earth will do right. God is not cruel. God is not capricious. God is not like one of the Babylonian gods, destroying the world because men annoy them. Okay. That's not who God is. God is a righteous God, and he is a just God. Okay. And he will keep his word.
Yeah. We've talked about this in previous classes, probably going back a couple of series and what we've done. But when we are concerned with the justice of God, we don't necessarily just think about the destruction that God allows to happen. We also have to think about the fact that it's human choice that is leading to that destruction. And sometimes by taking action against one people or a city, in this case, God is saving future generations that would have gone through that mess of a culture and of a city and going that direction. So there's a lot of layers going on here. It's in some ways, God is saving not just 10, not just 50, but hundreds of people that would have been a part of Sodom and Gomorrah in future generations. And those people will never be and will never have to go through that because of what is done here. We see, just to bring this through, God does save the family of Lot. Lot himself, Lot's wife, Lot's two daughters. They try to get the husbands out of there, and there's all sorts of questions about what's going on there. They choose to stay, and very famously, as they are leaving, Lot's wife turns around. Going back to our last series, talking about idolatry, we wonder. We're led to believe that she is longing for what she's left behind. whether it's longing for the clay pots that she owned, her possessions, or if it was a cultural thing, the friends that she had. We don't quite know what she's longing for, but rather than obeying what is ahead of her, she looks back, and she is destroyed because of that too. So we're also dealing here with this question of righteousness. And Jeremy, I know I'm remembering you talking about this, when we've talked about, is it Romans 3 or Romans 5? Man would scarcely die for for a righteous person,
right.
for a good person.
Romans 5, I think.
Okay. So as we're thinking about this, I think it's important for us to also view this story through our Christian lens, right? Through the lens of the cross. That not only does God get talked down from he gets talked down from all of the people who have ever lived down to one. And it is one righteous person that dies on behalf of all people. As Abraham is counting them down, and Jeremy, you made this connection earlier. We go from this story of Abraham interceding on behalf of Sodom, to Abraham willing to offer up his own son, and God, of course, spares him that sacrifice. And in the end, God is willing to sacrifice his own son. And as Christians, I don't think we don't often enough think about this. But not only did Jesus die for me, he died for Jeremy, he died for you. Jesus died for Sodom and Gomorrah. Jesus died for all people, and peoples whose cultures are antithetical to ours, who we would not consider to be part of what we would think of as the world we want to live in. Jesus died for them too. And so as God is being bargained down, if I can use that language, God is thinking about his son. The Father thinks of the Son and the sacrifice that has to be made there, because part of the intercession is a plea for redemption. It's a plea for that Redeemer. And as we know as Christians, there's only one way that redemption can properly be manifested, and obviously that is through Jesus.
Yeah, I think the idea of redemption it's powerful in what's going on here, not least of which, because Abraham has not been perfect, and Abraham probably is becoming more and more aware of all of the ways he has fallen short. And yet, despite all that, and in 18 he says, in a year I'm going to return, and Sarah will have a child, a son. Okay, so Abraham is thinking back, and he's thinking, for 24 years God bore with me. And he may not be thinking it in exactly these terms when he probably would have been thinking it in ancient Hebrew, but that's a different issue. But something along the lines of, for 24 years God has been bearing with me as I have tried to do things my way. And yet still he has stayed with me. He stayed with Abraham through all of the ups and the downs, through lying to Pharaoh, lying to Abimelech. See, he pulled that trick twice, or tried to at any rate. The whole Hagar and Ishmael mess, telling God, how about Eliezer be my heir instead? And God said, no, you're going to have a son. Okay. Through Abraham laughing, through Sarah laughing. Okay. Through all of that, God has not wavered. Okay. God has kept going. And I think that, as in addition to this, is part of what is the foundation for Abraham receiving Isaac back from the dead. And no, he didn't literally receive Isaac back from the dead, but as the author of Hebrews points out in Hebrews 11, which the person in the Old Testament that has the most, is talked about the most in Hebrews 11, is Abraham. Okay. And when the author of Hebrews 11 is talking about Abraham, he says, Abraham he thought that God could raise the dead, which is a remarkable thought, because to that point, no one had been raised from the dead. Like we have testimony of people being raised from the dead. Abraham didn't. Okay. So he is imagining that God can do what to his mind is unfathomable unfathomable, impossible, has never happened in the history of mankind. And yet Abraham goes, I know God. And I know what God said. And I know that God stayed with me through the ups and the downs and the good and the bad. So I'm going to trust him. Okay. And the core of that trust was that he knew God. And he knew that God was faithful, and God would not ask him to do something without having a good reason, or just God would not ask him to do something that God didn't already have an idea of what he was going to do with it. And so, as the Hebrews author says, God basically receives, Abraham basically receives Isaac back from the dead, which is pretty remarkable, because the author of Hebrews is saying that Abraham fully intended to do it. He fully intended to kill his son that day. No backsliding. No, should I? No, he was going to do it. Okay. And I think Abraham learned about God, and he learned about the justice of God, the faithfulness of God, the redemption of God. Okay. He said he knew God is just, but God is merciful, and he promised all men would be blessed through Isaac. So somehow he's going to make that happen.
Well, we are running up against time, so let's go to closing thoughts, and specifically as we're thinking about questioning God. Jeremy, as you're reflecting on the questions that Abraham was asking, how does this change me and you, us as Christians?
Well, in kind of an overarching kind of introducing the series, it's okay to ask God questions. And indeed, the honesty of God shows a certain level of faith that he will have answers. Okay. And then in this specific question, we see a God who is approachable, boldly so. We see a God who reveals himself. See, God doesn't just reveal, this is what I'm going to do. He does it in a way that allows Abraham to ask these questions. So God is boldly approachable. God wants us to want to know him. Okay. And so he provides these avenues for us to go to God and say, God, what's going on here? I don't know. I don't understand. Can you help me? And, the answer, or the character of God that we learn here is the judge of all the earth will do right. God is a just God. God is a merciful God. The judge of all the earth will do right. And of course, as we talked about before, God's justice and God's mercy, he brings them together in his son.
So, just a closing thought here. I'm thinking about a couple of books that our girls have, some children's picture books. And one of them is titled Mama, Do You Love Me? The other one's titled Daddy, Do You Love Me? And basically both of the books is a child of the mother and of the father, asking them outlandish questions. What if I did this? What if I did that? And every time, mommy and daddy are going to say, if you did that, it would make me sad, or make me happy, or make me scared, but I would still love you. And Jeremy, I like the language that you used, plumbing the depths, finding out. And the only way to do that is to ask questions, is to ask God, how far will you go? Now, this isn't an invitation to sin. It's not an invitation to do all of the crazy things that might actually test God. We're not testing God, but we're asking God, God, will you go with me here? And God is always guiding us to the place where we can best serve him. And when we ask God those probing questions, plumbing the depths, we will find out that God's love and God's justice are deeper than we can imagine. And we cannot go deep enough into the ocean and find a place where God's love does not exist. So with that, we will go ahead and end our session here. we will come back with another person from the Bible and some of the questions that they asked, and we're going to continue that on throughout this series. We're looking forward to it, and we're glad you joined us for this conversation. See you next week.